So our speaker today, Dann, Professor Emeritus, Morrisville State College, head docent at the Gerrit Smith Estate, founder of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, which if you have not been there, I encourage you to do so. Treasurer of the Peterboro Area Museum. 10 books on Peterboro, biographies of each of the Smiths. He is here today. Please give him a hand, revealing the story of Gerrit Smith, the practical dreamer.
People frequently ask me more about my own personal interests in this, how I got involved in it, so I'm going to do a little bit with that first. But as a further introduction, I taught at Morrisville, SUNY Morrisville, for 33 years, and absolutely loved it. It wasn't even a job, it was just fun. I had a great time there. The students were great, the colleagues were great, the administration was okay, and we had good times, and I enjoyed that. Never had a bad day at work for 33 years. Can anybody here say that? I mean, it's an amazing experience that I had. It wasn't, I treated it like fun. And I retired 25 years ago. So where did it all go? And since then, I've been working on research and writing, and I'm going to say something very quickly about each of the books. If there's something there that triggers an interest in your mind, talk to me later about it. I'll tell you more about them. The biography of Gerrit Smith is the prime book of it all, and I'll tell you more about that in just a few minutes. But the others, there are biographies of his daughter, Elizabeth, who became active in the women's rights movement, in especially dress reform and suffrage. There's a bio of his son, Green, who was a nationally known ornithologist and sportsman. There's a bio of his wife, Anne, who was the daughter of a slaveholding family in Maryland. Interesting connection with an abolitionist. And she became active in the abolition movement with him. There is a bio of his father, Peter, hence Peterboro, named for him. And Peter was involved with the Native Americans in land speculation, which is a fascinating story we're still dealing with in what are called Native American land claims, if you're interested in that. And he built the foundation of the fortune that Gerrit used. We'll talk more about that. There's a dual biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Gerrit Smith. They were first cousins. That surprises some people. Their mothers were sisters from the Livingston family downstate. And so she spent a lot of time with him. Give you a quick summary, the two most important social movements for human rights in U.S. history are the abolition of slavery and women's rights, both ongoing today, right? So we have still not gained what we need. The two most powerful leaders of both of those movements worked together and learned their tactics together in Peterboro. And I'll tell you the story of it maybe later on, but that's what that book deals with. There is a book there entitled Whatever It Takes. It's a history of the abolition movement as a whole, with emphasis on Gerrit Smith when he comes on the scene. There is When We Get to Heaven. That's coverage of the Underground Railroad, the runaway slaves called the North Heaven. And it documents whatever I could about what happened in Peterboro, and you can document more about what happened in Peterboro than probably anywhere else in the country on the Underground Railroad because of the letters that are available in the Gerrit Smith collection, which is at SU, by the way. There is a synopsis of the 5 biographies there if you're interested in the short version. What else? Oh, a biography of Gerrit Smith Miller. He is Gerrit and Ann Smith's grandson, who introduced the first thoroughbred Holstein cattle into the United States in 1869. Fascinating story for anyone that's interested in the cattle or dairy industry. My interest in doing the research and writing work started seriously in 1992. I had developed an interest in racial issues from my work in teaching sociology. And racism bothered me. It still does. I mean, it's madness. And it's a topic that I can develop passion about personally and do something about it. And in the fall of 1990, and I knew when I was teaching there at Morrisville that there was a guy that lived up the road in Peterboro named Gerrit Smith, and he was an abolitionist. That's all I knew. That's all I could have told you. So in the fall of '92, I started talking with a woman who lived in Peterboro. And she was into the history of it a bit and knew a little bit about it, and said to me one evening, we were taking a walk up the road, she said to me someone needs to research and write a new biography of Gerrit Smith. Norm, why don't you do it? And I thought maybe she was nuts. This is Dorothy Wilsey. Some of you probably know her. We married 3 years later, so the story is ongoing. And she is now president of the National Abolition Hall of Fame in Peterboro. And I work mostly with the Gerrit Smith estate. I'm the head docent there, do a lot of tours. So we're in this together still. And I thought about, write a biography of Gerrit Smith? No way. Those are gigantic projects. I know that. You're talking decades worth of work here. Maybe I'd like to know more about him, maybe write an article or something like that. 2 weeks later, I went to a presentation on the abolition movement by Dr. Milton Cernett, who was a professor at the time in African American history at Syracuse University. He's now retired also, and works with us on the board of directors for the Abolition Hall of Fame. And during his talk, he was in the basement of a church in Oneida. You get the picture? Giving this presentation. And he said during the presentation, somebody needs to research and write a new biography of Gerrit Smith. I said, what? That's twice in 2 weeks I have heard people in the know say the same thing. Why are they saying that? So after his presentation, I went up and introduced myself and asked him why he said that. And he said, well, the biographical work that has been done on Gerrit Smith is unfair to him. Ooh, well, that's an indictment of somebody's work. If the biographical work is unfair, that's pretty serious stuff. So I figured, well, maybe I'll look into this and see why somebody is saying this about that work. And I knew there were 3 biographies of Gerrit Smith already written. 2 of them were written early after his death. He died in 1874. First one in 1878, and the second one was published in 1900, both by friends of the family, which was common at the time to have that done that way. And they were both eulogies of a noble man that did so much good with his money. Make sense? Yeah, he did. He did. He would talk more about his money in a few minutes. But both of them were talking about his extreme goodness. The third one was published in the 1930s and was written by the person who was at the time the chair of the history department at SU. And it was a really sarcastic, caustic criticism of this wealthy fool who wasted so much money. That's true, too. He knew it. He agreed that he was wasting a lot of his money, but he said, I've got so much of it, it doesn't really make any difference. But he wanted to be sure he helped those who really needed it, and in the process, if he wasted some money, it didn't bother him. But here's what was available in the biographies. 2 of them talked about his noble wonderfulness, and the other one about his foolishness. So those are the extremes. The extremes of people are easy to see. It's not so easy to see the real person who was very complex and complicated and somewhere in the middle. So I figured, yep, maybe this is a worthwhile project. So I got started. And that, again, was in the fall of 1992. And it was not until February of 2009 that the biography was published. These are huge projects, and there is so much available. The Smith papers at SU, there are 155 boxes of nothing but correspondence. And as Patrick mentioned, I dare you to read his handwriting. I put a couple of examples of it in here, scanned them in. I don't know why, just to frustrate readers, I guess, but to show you what you're dealing with. And I think you're right, Patrick, that a reason why there hasn't been a lot of research done on Gerrit Smith is because of his penmanship. People probably got started, tried, and said, oh, phooey, it's impossible to read, and there's thousands of letters. You're going to read all those? Well, I developed the ability to read it, but it's still tough. You don't read them fast. It takes time. But what I determined eventually, and I want to corroborate this with other scholars too, is that Gerrit Smith became the most powerful abolitionist in the United States, out of thousands. Now that's a radical statement to make. How can you justify saying that? Two other authors have done significant research work into Gerrit Smith. One of them is John Stauffer. He's a professor at Harvard. He's been to Peterboro many times and helped me with some of the stuff I was doing. He wrote a book entitled The Black Hearts of Men, and he did some serious research on Gerrit Smith in that. He didn't get it all right, and I've talked to him about that, but anyway, it's there. And the other is Fergus Bordewich, who wrote a book entitled Bound for Canaan. It's the best book you can read on the Underground Railroad, bar none. It's a marvelous piece of research. And he did some serious research into Gerrit Smith, and the three of us agree that Gerrit Smith became the most powerful abolitionist in the United States. How? How did he do that? There are two factors involved of importance. One is his money. Two is his philanthropy. He didn't want the money. He was, in our terms, a multi-billionaire. He gave away during his lifetime in money that I can trace in the ledgers around $1 billion in our terms. And there was much more because a lot of it wasn't recorded. People would come to his house begging and he'd just give them a few bucks, and not even record it. So I know a lot of it wasn't recorded. And in the process of giving away this money, he became powerful. He had enough, he had the one resource that everybody else needed no matter what they were doing. So they came to Peterboro to get it. And how did he reach that point? What's the source of the money? How did he get into it and become so rich? All right, we've got to start out with his father, Peter. Peter Smith, he was born in 1768, downstate in Rockland County near Tappan. Some of you probably recognize those names. And of Dutch ancestry. And he got into some early work with a partner named John Jacob Astor. Oh yeah, that one. And the two of them were kids. They were teenagers, and they got into stage acting. They liked to be actors. They got into plays and presentations in New York City in the late 1700s. And they were both working for a pittance. Peter was working as a clerk in an accounting house. That's what we would call an accounting firm, and making almost nothing. And he says, this is nuts, I want to be rich. And Astor was doing the same thing. So the two of them got together and became involved in the fur trade with Native Americans upstate. And Peter eventually settled in the Utica area. It was called Old Fort Schuyler then, over where the Baggs Hotel used to be. And he traded with the Native Americans in furs by trading them dry goods and sending the furs downstate to Astor where he lived, and he would sell them for huge profits. And this is how the fortune got started. Both fortunes got started. But the fur trade dried up in upstate New York in the early 1790s, so if you wanted to stay active in that, you had to move west. Astor did. Peter did not. But the two of them stayed in partnership in land speculation with the Native Americans. This was right after the Revolutionary War, and the U.S. had confiscated huge amounts of land, and was, New York State, I should say, had confiscated, and was trying to sell it to pay off its war debts. And land speculators got into this. Peter was just one of them. There were many land speculators, and most of them were hated by the Native Americans for reasons I'm sure you can understand. They were getting ripped off. And uncharacteristically, the Native Americans liked Peter Smith. That's an important point because it becomes much more meaningful later on, as you'll see. So Peter gets into the land speculation business by at first leasing 50,000 acres of land from the Native American Oneidas. And that was because there were rules against selling land to private individuals at the time. That didn't last long. That was in 1793. In 1795, New York State purchased by treaty 100,000 acres of land from the Oneidas, including the 50,000 that Peter had leased. So this nullifies his lease, right? Now, what does he do? If he wants to stay in the land business, he's got to buy it back from New York State, which is what he does. Now he has clear title to it and can begin to sell it and become rich. Now, footnote, and you already know this, I'm sure. The treaty that New York State wrote with the Oneidas was illegal, which made the whole land purchase illegal. And the reason for that was that the U.S. Constitution had already been ratified, and it specified that no state could write treaties with foreign nations. New York State did, knowingly, write treaties with the Native Americans, which are foreign nations, and got away with it. What? How did that happen? How come New York State got away with this for so long, right up until now? Because I think, and this is speculation, I think the bias against Native Americans was so high, nobody really cared what happened to them. They were just savages, ignorant people that needed to be cleaned out of the area so that these encroaching Europeans could come in and take it over. So it got ignored for many, many decades. But that is the facts of it, and it's why we still have Native American land claims. Anyway, Peter starts selling this property and becomes rich. Now, enter Gerrit. Gerrit becomes a young man. He has some schooling in the Peterboro area. Peter moved his family from Utica to Peterboro in January of 1807. That was just after the land office and the house and the barn had been built. When they were finished, Peter moved his family there. And the reason why Peterboro is where it is because it happened to be about in the center of his land holdings. So if he needed to travel, he could go either way about the same distance. But as you know, Peterboro is off the main routes of everything. I like that. I live in Peterboro, by the way. I live in a house that used to be part of the Gerrit Smith estate. In fact, the picture on the front of the book entitled Gat, who is Gerrit Smith Miller, is the house I live in, because it was his house. He lived there for 40 years, the Holstein man. So when Gerrit becomes of age to go to school, he has the option of going to college. That's rare in those days. There weren't many colleges, and not many people went, especially women. That's sort of a footnote there. Women were discriminated against intensely in the 1800s, and of course still are. If you challenge any of my comments about the presence of current discrimination going on within these two movements, that is, movements that involve race or sex, watch the campaign ads tonight and you'll see it's very, very clear that it is still with us. So Gerrit gets the chance to go to college. And he goes to Hamilton College in Clinton over here because Peter already has connections there. Peter has some serious connections with Samuel Kirkland, who was important in establishing that institution. So Gerrit goes there and starts his college work in 1814. He takes a 4-year curriculum in what was called classical letters. I've looked at it. It's in minor ways, but somewhere akin to what I think you and I would recognize as liberal arts. You know, sort of a smattering of what it is you could know at the time. And he graduated in 1818 as the valedictorian of his class of 10. Like I said, not many people went to college then. And he returned to Peterboro with a dream. He's got a dream. He wants to become an attorney. That's how he wants to spend his life. So he has to go back to school to become an attorney. He never did. Why didn't he do that? Because the day after he returned from college to Peterboro, his mother died. It was very unexpected. She died of cholera. Now, you know what that is. It's a waterborne disease. It's a dehydration disease. It can kill very quickly if it's uncontrolled, matter of a few days. Nobody knew at that time what caused it. The cause of cholera was not discovered until 1854. Gerrit Smith is 57 years old. He was born in 1797. Well, his life is 2/3 over before they find out that the water you're drinking out of the dug well in the yard or out of the brook just may kill you. So the most frequent health complaint that I read about in the letters between family members was disordered bowels. Yeah. Well, they didn't know what was causing it. We do. So it was a hazard for life at that time. Anyway, his mother dies the day after he comes home from college. This sends Peter into deep depression. That makes sense? Peter was a very much unliked man. He had few of anything we could call friends. He was arrogant, mean, avaricious, selfish, and people did not like Peter Smith. An interesting side story here for you. I knew we needed a biography of Peter Smith because nothing had ever been written. I couldn't believe it when I went to look at the literature. There was nothing. So I tried to get someone to do a biography of Peter Smith. And at the time, I was still teaching at Morrisville, and there was another history professor there who was looking for a project. I said, hey, I got one for you. We need a biography of this guy. He said, good, that sounds great. I'll get busy on it. He went into the papers at SU, started reading through the papers, he found out what kind of a man Peter Smith was, as I just described to you. And he said, I'm not going to write about him. Nobody'd ever read it. Who would ever want to read about a guy like that? All right. So I picked it up a couple of years later, but he was not a well-liked man. So when his wife, Elizabeth Livingston, dies, he is alone. Not just physically, but mentally. And he wants out of Peterboro. Too many memories. He has to leave. So, in order to do that, he has to sell his business, his land sale business, to somebody. And of course, he ends up selling it to Gerrit. Gerrit is not the only offspring. Peter and Elizabeth had 4 children. The first was Cornelia, a woman, out of the picture totally for business. The second was Peter Jr. They called him Peter Shenandoah, or Sken for short, because he was named after the Oneida chief, because the Oneidas were so friendly with Peter Smith. He was an alcoholic. So his father said, no way. Gerrit's next in line. Gerrit says, I don't want the business. I don't want to sit in that little land office and shuffle papers for 50 years, but he did. He took it out of a sense of obligation. So he buys the business from his father. Notice that? He got nothing free. He had to buy the business from his father for $225,000, in those days dollars. Now, if you want to understand what that means today, we need to multiply by the inflation factor of around 70. How fast is your head math? That puts you in the multi-millions. And this is, now Gerrit Smith is a young college graduate, and he's in debt, millions of dollars, in our terms, to his father. And his father's holding the mortgage. And he gives Gerrit, the only thing he gave Gerrit was 10 years without interest, after which what's not paid back is charged interest. I think it was 7%. It wasn't low. Anyway, Gerrit eventually pays this back. You can forget that. He did pay it back. And in the process of doing so, he has to run the business. So he's now working in the land office. It's pictured right on the front of the book. He's working in the land office, probably is my estimation, between 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. And he did that for 55 years when he died. He never retired. So he worked hard at what he was doing, and it was buying and selling land and being philanthropic about the things he could do. And he becomes so rich that he wants to do something with the money to achieve social justice. It's an interesting phrase. Smith believed that every person was born with a God-given right to equity. This was natural law. You follow me there? Natural law with a capital N. That every person is born equal and deserves that treatment throughout life. Obviously, that wasn't happening then or now. And he said, well, then let's do something about that. All right, how do you do it? Well, he's got this marvelous resource that he can use to lubricate the wheels of change in these social movements that are blossoming out for human rights. And the technique that he used was to target his money at people who were in the front lines of action in those movements. Gerrit Smith did not like to travel. He loved Peterboro, and that's where he wanted to stay. He wrote about it so many times in very romantic terms in his letters. He'd write to Anne when they were apart. They were apart a lot. He'd write to her and say, this is a beautiful morning in Peterboro. Is it possible that there is any place else on earth with mornings as beautiful as Peterboro? You know, it was just a marvelous head in loving what he had. So he didn't travel much. He'd get a lot of letters requesting him to attend conferences and conventions and political meetings, and he'd usually write back to the manager of those meetings and say something like, I appreciate the invitation, but the press of my business is such that I cannot leave. That was BS. He could have gone anywhere he wanted to go. He just didn't want to go. And because he had clerks to operate the business just as he did, they knew everything they needed to know to do what he did. And when he wasn't there, they did it. So they could have done it at any time, but he just didn't want to go anywhere. So in order to have the influence and become a powerful person, he sent money. And he chose the people to whom he sent it carefully. For instance, Frederick Douglass. I see a lot of nods. People understand. Douglass was an escaped slave from the Maryland area in 1838. He goes up to Boston in that area and meets up with Garrison, who was the head of the Boston clique of abolitionists and a journalist with the Liberator. And he works with Garrison. Garrison invites him in to his clique, and he travels with Garrison doing abolition speaking for a few years. But he doesn't like what Garrison is doing. Garrison is a moral suasionist. You know what that means? It means preaching. Garrison was morally trying to persuade slave owners to stop because they were sinning. You think they were listening? Well, Douglas sees this, of course, immediately and says, oh, nuts. I got to get out of here. Garrison is doing stuff that is wasting time, money, and effort. We need to do something different. And also, Douglas wanted to be a journalist. So he had to get away from the Boston area, which was dominated by Garrison and the Liberator. So he moved to Rochester. Rochester at that time, this was 1847, was on the frontier. This was wild country. And he did that because he wanted to get in on the ground floor of influence in the territory with people moving in, and that was rapid. And he started a newspaper which he called the North Star. You knew that, right? The North Star. Problem. He had enough money from some previous work he'd done to get the paper going, but he didn't have enough to keep it going. So what happens? Knock, 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 knock. On Gerrit Smith's door, probably the land office door that you walk through when you go there. The threshold is original in the land office. I love to attract people's attention to the fact that Gerrit Smith and Frederick Douglass wore that down. You can try now, wear it down a little more. People stand there and scuff it, put their influence into it. So Douglass, without the money to keep his paper going, comes to Peterboro, of course. He's heard about this guy out there. So he comes to Peterboro, tells Gerrit his story about what he's doing with journalism and abolition, and Smith loves it, just loves it. This is right up his work. Smith likes to see quick, tangible evidence of his philanthropy. You with me? I mean, Smith is not going to donate $50,000 or $100,000 to some big institution like a university or a railroad or an oil company or something and see what they do with it in 10 years. He wants to donate smaller amounts to people who have their lives changed by it, and he can see that. He loves that. So Douglas comes with this idea of supporting his journalism, and Smith likes it and begins funding Frederick Douglass at the rate of $100 a month for years. Well, times 70, he's giving Douglass $7,000 a month in our terms to publish a small newspaper. It really helped. So, and the important point I want to make here is relative to Gerrit Smith's power as an abolitionist. Newspapers at the time were hugely powerful molders of public opinion. If you wanted to know what was going on in the nation, you had to have a newspaper. There was no other source. It wasn't like, we've got these things in our pocket, of televisions and radios and all. There's all kinds of news. You don't even need a newspaper. Many people don't even get newspapers these days. And I joke sometimes about those who do. They don't read them. What I call, they survey them. You get the newspaper and you flip through it and read whatever interests you, the business page or the fashion page or the sports page or the comics or whatever interests you. Then it goes over there in the bin for recycling. People don't read newspapers through. If you got one of Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, when it came to your house, you read it. Everything in it. There weren't even departments, like the sports or, different sections like that. It was just whenever an article arrived for printing, they stuck it there. And the next one went there because you were going to read the whole thing anyway. And when you were finished reading it, where did it go? To your neighbor. And from him or her to another neighbor. It circulated the community so that the subscription rate did not reflect the reading rate. It was a powerful organization to do this, and a really powerful influence in the community in an important way. And this is the way. It recruited people into the abolition movement. If you want to build a social movement for abolishing slavery How do you do that? You've got to get a power base, right? I mean, you've got to get hundreds of thousands of people behind you that are going to support you, vote, money, contribute. And that's a difficult process to recruit the public into a movement. Newspapers did that. And these folks knew it. So the fact that Gerrit Smith funded Douglas's North Star makes Smith the power broker. He was sitting in his office, working, buying land, selling land, making money, and writing checks to Frederick Douglass or John Brown. You knew he funded John Brown, right? John Brown goes to Harper's Ferry, shoots the place up, triggers the Civil War. Brown could not have done that without Smith's money. So you see what happens to him? He becomes again the check-writing power broker. When Brown was captured, he had a $100 uncashed check from Gerrit Smith in his possessions. There was no question as to whether or not there was a hard paper trail to the land office in Peterboro. It was obvious that he was one of the conspirators in that raid on Harper's Ferry. How come Brown came to Peterboro? What did he know? Well, John Brown first visit to Peterboro was in 1848. I can document 6 visits of John Brown to Peterboro. The first one was triggered by Brown's need for money. He wanted to raise an army, which he did. He raised a small army, if you could call it that, of about 20 men, and he needed to feed them, clothe them, house them, train them, move them, and that's all takes money, which he didn't have. So he comes to Peterboro, and he talks to Gerrit Smith. This is interesting. Smith is a peace man. He is vice president of the American Peace Society in 1848. He is what I think we would call a civil disobedience-oriented person, you know what I mean? Sort of like Gandhi or King. No, nonviolence. And Brown comes knocking on the door and says, listen to me. You're getting tired, you're getting burned out, you're working hard for abolition, and you're getting nowhere. I have the solution. And of course, Smith wants to know what that is. But Brown says we need to use violence to end slavery. Now, this is antithetical to Gerrit Smith's lifestyle. So what does he do? He is getting tired and wonders what to do to try next. He's tried moral suasion, and that was a waste. He's tried politics, which I'll get to in a few minutes, and that wasn't working too quickly. And so this guy Brown comes and says, let's try violence. And Smith says, well, okay, I tell you what, I'll give you the money to do what you need to do, but don't ever tell me what you're doing. See, he tried to sanitize his own mind by telling Brown, here's the money, but I'm going to turn and look the other way. I don't want to know what you're doing with it. And that's the way it went. So Brown does what he wants to do, and he gets this army and takes them to Harper's Ferry and does shoot the place up, almost gets killed himself. Brown expected to die in that raid, but he didn't. He almost did, but he didn't. And then he went to trial, of course, and the trial is famous for what he was saying there. But the raid actually caused so much anger among Southerners. You know, these rascal Northerners are coming down here now on our lawn and shooting us, that they shot back at Fort Sumter. That starts the Civil War. Brown knew, and he was trying to convince Gerrit of this. Brown knew that if a war started between the North and the South would lose. It was inevitable that the South would lose the war. And in your Civil War history, I'm sure you've come across that. piece of knowledge. What was going on was a war between two different cultures. It wasn't two different sections of a nation like most people want to think of it. There was a slave culture and a free culture. And it marinated people in the ideas of either slavery or freedom. And the difference in the economies between the North and the South was so huge that the South couldn't possibly win the war. It was a non-incentive-based slave economy. No one had incentive to improve things. And the North was just the opposite. And the North, the population, of course, was much larger anyway, but there was an incentive to develop businesses, banking, transportation, communication services were extensive compared to the South. So the South was just going to lose. The unfortunate thing was that it took 4 years to win the war. And that was because the North had selected timid generals who refused to fight. And once Lincoln finally found Grant and others, the war ended. So anyway, that's a side topic. So Gerrit Smith is funding John Brown, and this boosts his power and what he's accomplishing. He also funded Harriet Tubman. You know what she did, back and forth to the South. The latest biography on that is excellent is Kate Clifford Larson's Bound for the Promised Land. There's a lot of biographies of Harriet Tubman out there. The best one you can pick up and read is Larson's. It's extremely well researched and written. And she has discovered that Harriet Tubman went back to the South either 10 or 11 times and rescued approximately 70 additional slaves. Have you seen the movie 12 Years a Slave? Anybody? Oh, I see quite a few nods. I recommend that. I don't recommend many movies, but that one, if you're interested in the abolition movement, that's a good one, and it's going to be extremely difficult for you to watch it. Be prepared. It does depict slavery as it really was, and it's the only actual dramatic exposition of it that I have ever seen that does so. If you had ever managed as a slave, just imagine if you can that you were a slave and you escaped from that. Would you go back? Man, I wouldn't. She did. 10 times? Talk about guts. She was doing it on Smith's money. He funded her. She liked to come through Peterboro. She narrates this in her own work, that when she got to Peterboro, she knew everything was a cinch from there to Canada, and the slaves had to get to Canada because of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, right? So they had to keep going. They couldn't stay. They were very transient when they went through Peterboro or any station in the north. And she narrates about the fact that there was everything she needed: money, clothing, food, transportation, protection, everything was there. It was, from there on, it was easy. Easier, put it that way. So he becomes this powerful manipulator of a system of institutions that is pushing for human rights. There's at least one other important story you need to hear about human rights movements and Gerrit Smith and what happened in Peterboro. There was a young woman who came to Peterboro to visit the Smith family when she was a teenager. This was in the 1830s. She writes about this in her own autobiography. She liked to come to Peterboro because of the intellectual atmosphere there. And she met important people there and enjoyed talking with them and learning about their ideas in human rights. Her name was Elizabeth Cady. Yeah, that one. What the heck was she doing in Peterboro? The little book, Cousins of Reform, I told you before, they were cousins. Elizabeth Livingston was Gerrit Smith's mother, right? Elizabeth Livingston had a sister named Margaret Livingston who married Daniel Cady. Their daughter Elizabeth is therefore Gerrit Smith's first cousin. So she was coming to Peterboro to visit what she called Cousin Gerrit. And while she was there, she's meeting people like Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Salmon P. Chase, Charles Sumner, Joshua Giddings. I mean, these are the giants in the national institutions of government in a pro-slavery fashion. Senate, House, and Supreme Court. They're all in Peterboro. They have come there to get money for what they need to do and to talk to Gerrit Smith and hear his ideas and pursue these human rights goals. So she's meeting these people, and she's a teenager, Elizabeth Cady. She meets an important person there named Henry Brewster Stanton. Well, you know what happened there, so we'll pass on. She also meets somebody else there that's a lot more important than Henry, and that is Native Americans. They are still there around the territory because they are friendly with the Smith family. At the time, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes, they were sleeping on the porch or in the kitchen, eating at the dinner table, building council fires in the woods around and staying there. They were that friendly with the Smith family, and this is in the 1830s. So what's important about that? She has a lot of talk with these Native Americans. They're matriarchal, right? Yep, Native American culture is matriarchal, meaning the women have the economic and political power, not the men. Men are subservient to women. Well, teenage Elizabeth Cady sees this and says, what the dickens is wrong with us? We can do this too. Let's get started. And this launches her into a lifetime of work in women's rights. That happened in Peterboro. And then she visited Peterboro, I don't even know how many times. She was there a lot, talking with Gerrit. They didn't agree all the time. They worked on tactics, social movement and protest tactics together. And they didn't always agree. She would frequently shake her finger in his face and say something like, Cousin Gerrit, you just don't get it, especially when it came to women's rights. He had trouble there, yes. He grew up in a house full of women and lived with them, but he still had trouble getting himself inside a woman's head to understand what's really going on there. I think that's still a problem. That's a common issue. And she would tell him, you need to rethink this. For instance, he would call her Mrs. Stanton. And she'd shoot back at him, no, I have very serious objections to being called Henry. So my name is Elizabeth, and please call me that. And if you don't like that, I will start calling you Mr. Fitzhugh, which is his wife's maiden name. So shake his finger. And they had a lot of arguments like that, back and forth in letters, so you can actually get into it and read them. One last thing, and then we'll take some questions. When Gerrit Smith became disillusioned with moral suasion as a technique of approaching abolition, he knew he had to get a different tool to do the job because that wasn't working. And he had this idea that really contradicted a lot of his own behavior, and that was, let's try politics. And Gerrit Smith was apolitical. You know what that means? Apolitical. He didn't want anything to do with it. If you were an anti-slavery politician looking for office, he would fund you. You'd get more money than you'd ever need from him. He would just dole it out so that your campaign could be successful and you'd get elected to office. And the idea, of course, was this is a democracy. If we can elect enough anti-slavery politicians to office, they can work with rules to eliminate slavery. So let's get started. Well, the two major parties at the time were the Whigs and the Democrats. both pro-slavery. The Whigs maybe a little less than the Democrats, but so you can't go there. What are you going to do? Start a third party. Well, I'm sure you know the history of third parties in American politics, and they knew that too. But the goal of a third party is not to get elected. And most of the time, the people that organize these things know that. The goal is to make a lot of noise. Get the issue, in this case abolition, get the issue out there before the public and begin to recruit the public in such numbers that eventually it will become such a powerful political base that one of the major parties will have to pick it up as part of their platform. See, that's the way it's supposed to work. Well, it never did. But what did happen was of more interest. The four men got together in Gerrit Smith's house in Peterboro in late 1839 and decided to form what they call the Liberty Party. They nominated their first presidential candidate, one of those four men. His name was James Gillespie Birney, and he had been a former slaveholder turned abolitionist, so he made a pretty good candidate. And in 1840, he got about 6,000 votes for president. It's negligible, it's a very tiny amount. So they knew that they had to keep working to get a bigger population base. So they did. And in 1844, they nominated Birney again for president of the country. And that time he got somewhere around 100,000 votes. So that was pretty significant. Somebody out there is listening, right? So let's keep at this. And they did. Well, between 1844 and 1854, there were a number of other anti-slavery political factions that developed. There was the Liberty Party, then there was the Liberty League, there was the Free Soil Party that came about in 1848, and other factions. There were factions of anti-slavery interest in both the major parties. They were small, but they were there. And in 1854, all of these various anti-slavery factions coalesced and created the Republican Party. That's the Republican Party that exists today, organizationally, not philosophically. Have to be careful here. People begin to shake their heads. Oh, what? They nominated the first presidential candidate in 1856. It was John C. Fremont. He was a military person from some campaigns in the West. He didn't get a lot of votes. But they tried again in 1860 and nominated a guy named Lincoln. Oh, yeah. Now you know what happened. He gets elected president. But in those days, the Republican Party were the radical, ultra-liberal human rights people. That has changed 180. It's just the opposite now. So when I have a chance, I enjoy speaking with candidates for office who are on the Republican ticket and asking them if they know where the Republican Party started. And there are various interpretations of it, all of which have some validity. Some say it was somewhere in New Hampshire, some say it was in Wisconsin. But the original seed that that germinated into the Republican Party happened in the Gerrit Smith house in Peterboro. Because that particular organization, the Liberty Party, over time morphed into the Republican Party that nominated and elected Lincoln. So, a lot of things to think about in human rights issues that revolve around Gerrit Smith and his family. They all had to support him, you know. He didn't do this alone. So that's important. Time for questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, and you may have covered it. I apologize, I was delayed. Where did he come up with, like, what was the influence for him to have premise for some of his beliefs?
Good question. I think I know the answer. And it is so simple, most people are shocked. There are a lot of explanations in former authors of efforts to describe where he got his philanthropy from. Some are religious. He was a Christian for a while, mostly in the middle stages of his life. He was so rich he may have felt guilty. So, I shake my head and say, well, not really. The real explanation of his philanthropy is genetic. That's a shocker. This is becoming more and more clear with what we're learning from the Human Genome Project, if any of you have followed some of that. And it is that what we're taught in school, me too, taking social sciences, is that human behavior, almost all of it is learned. You remember the behaviorists in psychology and the sociologists, the anthropologists, they all taught us that human behavior is learned. Yeah, a lot of it is, but a lot of it isn't. It's wired in. For instance, we now know that the tendency to alcoholism is inherited. If the social conditions apply, you will be that. And in most cases, they apply. So if you inherit that gene, you don't have a choice. And it's very tough to counteract it. We also know, for instance, that sexual preference is inherited. There's no choice. People don't decide to become straight or gay or whatever. It's wired in, and it's going to determine their result. We now also know that so is philanthropy. The tendency to be philanthropic is hardwired into the brain. So far, it has been traced to the number and complexity of neurons in the amygdala, which is a cluster of neurons in the temporal areas, 2 of them in the brain. And the size and complexity of neuronal connections in the amygdala correlates extremely highly with philanthropy. Gerrit Smith probably inherited that, certainly not from Peter, but his mother. His mother was a philanthropic person.
Was Gerrit Smith ever prosecuted for the support he gave John Brown?
No, and the reason why. The prosecution was based on treason against the state of Virginia, which is crazy because it was a federal arsenal that he invaded and captured. It should have been treason against the United States. However, the governor of Virginia at the time was a guy named Henry Wise. And Henry Wise was a racist. And he wanted to prosecute those people involved in the conspiracy of John Brown that were black. And so he went after Frederick Douglass. Douglass knew that was going to happen, and he ran for Canada. And he just barely got there before he was captured. And so he was outside. And then there was an investigative committee appointed by the U.S. Senate, which was called the Mason Committee, named for the Mason of Mason-Dixon fame. And they had hearings in Washington on the conspiracy that was led by John Brown. And they invited 2 of the co-conspirators of what was called the Secret Six, Gerrit Smith was one of them, to testify. But they didn't invite Smith, see? And the follow-up indicated that the questions asked of the 2 men during the testimony were so inane that they never found out anything about the raid, and nobody seemed to care. But Gerrit Smith, at the time that the trials were going on, became ill, and he was admitted to the Utica Insane Asylum. He was only there for a little while. And what happened was, the raid in Harper's Ferry was October 16th, 1859. On November 7th, this is a couple of weeks later, 3 weeks later, Gerrit Smith is admitted to the Utica Insane Asylum because he has become incoherent psychotically. He really was. The clinical case study notes of this are available at the State Museum in Albany, and you can read them as I did. And it is that he experienced what you and I would recognize as manic depressive syndrome, bipolar syndrome, and for a while lost contact with reality. He couldn't, this was while he was still at home in Peterboro, he couldn't sleep or eat. He was distrustful of his wife and children and household servants. He was becoming violent oriented, and his family, recognizing all these symptoms, said, we need to take him to an insane asylum, which was relatively new at the time. And he was begging them to take him to Charlestown, Virginia, to be tried with John Brown because he was as guilty as Brown was. That's how he felt. So his family built a ruse, and this is all written out by Gerrit Smith's clerk, Caleb Calkins. They built a ruse saying, okay, Gerrit, we'll take you to the train station in Utica so you can get on a train and go to Charlestown and be tried with John Brown. But when they went to Utica, they didn't take him to the train station. They took him to the hospital. And he was livid about it. He was shouting at them for doing this to him. But there was an intervening person by the name of John P. Gray. He was the superintendent of the Utica Insane Asylum at the time, and a medical doctor as well. And fortunately, Gerrit knew him from some previous contact and trusted him. And Gray said to Gerrit, you are ill. You need to stay here and get treatment. Do not go to Charlestown. Gerrit agreed, and he stayed there in the hospital. He was in the hospital under treatment for 4 weeks. And the treatment at the time was primitive at best. It was a change of diet, a change obviously of location and social connections, and medications that included alcohol and cannabis. Yeah, that ought to work. You want to change somebody's thought style? Well, he was only there for 4 weeks, and Dr. Gray diagnosed him as being well enough to leave the hospital. And he took Gerrit Smith to his own private home for 3 weeks, after which time Gerrit was gone back home to Peterboro, and he went back to work, and he was fine. Now, a question arises here that I want you to help me answer. How many of us know someone in the course of our lives who has, for whatever reason, had a period of time where they needed some psychological help, counseling, after which they were fine? I'll bet every hand in the room would go up, or almost every hand. See, that's not unusual. What happened to him was not unusual. It was treated at the time as being unusual because it made news. I mean, this was a national figure. You know, the guy's in the mental hospital. Oh my gosh, big headlines. Well, were your neighbors? Did your neighbor get headlines? No, but because not that important. So it made a big deal at the time, but it was a very common event, and it didn't affect him for the rest of his life. He lost it under stress. And if we had another half hour, I'd tell you what all of the stressors were in his life. But he was going through a lot of junk. He and his wife were having a midlife crisis in which they probably would have divorced had it been available liberally as it is now. His son, Green, was growing up as a family rebel, drinking and smoking and swearing and besmirching the family name, and they hated that and couldn't stop him. He was having physical problems with what he thought was blindness. He had hemorrhoids with 3 operations that cured nothing. And there were other factors. All of this was happening in the 1850s, which led up to the 1859 mental breakdown.
So how many children did he have, Gerrit? And then what became of that?
7.
And then any of them continued his philanthropic
activity?
Yes. They had 7 children. The firstborn was in 1822. That was Elizabeth. Her bio is over there. The lastborn was in 1842, 20 years later, and that was Green, and his bio is there. The 5 intervening children all died. It was a tough time for kids to stay alive. There were no, medicine was primitive. I mean, there was no antibiotics. You could get a cold and die. And they lost 3 in infancy. They lost a daughter at age 5 to, I think it was some kind of a convulsive disease, but I could never anchor down exactly what it was. And they lost a son at age 12 to dysentery. Dysentery. I mean, you know, go get some Pepto. We know what to do about this. They didn't. And that's another one of those dehydration diseases. 2 days and you're dead if you can't control it.
If his father Peter was so disliked, why did the Indians like him so?
Peter set up 4 stores. We'd call it like a chain. He had 4 small stores in New Hartford and Paris and around Utica. And he was trading with the Native Americans and giving them good deals. And they liked him. And the liking continued, obviously, for decades after that.
Dan, thank you so much for sharing your story.